The weight of silence. Emily Larson stared out the smudged window of the bus, her breath fogging up the glass in uneven patches. Her father, James, sat slouched next to her, his beer bottle poorly concealed in a brown paper bag. The stale smell of alcohol mixed with the faint scent of hospital antiseptic that clung to Emily's clothes. She fiddled nervously with the strap of her backpack, her fingers tracing over the worn fabric like a lifeline. The therapy session earlier that day had been like all the others. Encouraging words from Dr. Catherine, measured optimism from Dr. Simon, and her father's thinly veiled frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Emily had heard the tension in his voice, seen it in the way his jaw tightened every time a new cost or session was mentioned. She felt like a burden he couldn't shed, a problem that refused to be solved. As the bus jolted over a pothole, James grunted, nearly spilling the bottle he thought he had so cleverly hidden. Emily instinctively reached out to steady him, but he swatted her hand away with a muttered, "I'm fine." The other passengers on the bus kept their eyes firmly on their phones, books, or the dull view outside, avoiding the scene playing out in front of them. It wasn't the first time Emily had seen strangers look the other way when her father raised his voice, and it wouldn't be the last. She bit her lip, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. "You know what your problem is," James said, his voice loud enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby seats. "You've been coddled too much. All this therapy, all this fuss, it's a waste of money. You're not even trying to get better." Emily kept her gaze fixed on her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to tell him about how hard she had worked, how she had practiced tying her shoes for hours until her fingers ached, but she knew it wouldn't matter. James didn't want explanations. He wanted someone to blame. From the corner of her eye, Emily noticed a man sitting a few rows behind them. He was dressed neatly, his posture straight and composed, exuding an air of quiet authority. He had been glancing in their direction ever since her father started speaking, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. When their gazes met briefly, Emily quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't say anything. The last thing she needed was for her father to have another reason to get angry. "Do you hear me?" James barked, nudging her with his elbow. "Answer me when I'm talking to you." "Yes, Dad," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bus engine. "Yes, what?" James demanded, leaning closer. His breath reeked of alcohol, and Emily recoiled slightly. "Yes, I understand," she said, louder this time, hoping it would placate him. James leaned back in his seat, muttering something under his breath. The man in the back shifted slightly, his hands resting on his knees as if he were ready to stand up. Emily silently willed him to stay put. She didn't want a scene. She just wanted to get through the bus ride and go home. But home wasn't much better. The small apartment they shared was a far cry from the cozy house Emily remembered from her childhood. Back then, her mother had been alive. Her father hadn't yet fallen into the bottle, and there had been laughter instead of tension filling the rooms. Now the apartment felt like a cage, each wall closing in on her a little more every day. "People like you," James continued, his words slurred but still cutting. "They just take and take. Therapy, doctors, all those damn prosthetic consultations. It's like throwing money into a black hole. And for what? You still can't even." "Enough." The voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, authoritative. It cut through the air like a knife, silencing James mid-sentence. Emily looked up, startled, to see the man from the back of the bus standing in the aisle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an unmistakable presence. His piercing blue eyes locked onto James, his expression unreadable. James glared at him, his face flushing with anger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The man didn't flinch. Someone who doesn't appreciate hearing a child being spoken to like that. James snorted, waving his bottle dismissively. "Mind your own business, pal. This is between me and my daughter." "Respectfully," the man said, taking a step closer, When you raise your voice like that in public, it stops being just your business. Emily felt her stomach twist. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into her seat and become invisible. She could feel every pair of eyes on the bus now focused on them, the tension crackling like static electricity. James stood, swaying slightly as he did. "You've got some nerve," he growled, jabbing a finger in the man's direction. "You think you're better than me. You don't know a damn thing about us." The man didn't back down. If anything, he seemed even calmer than before, his voice steady and measured. "You're right. I don't know you. But I do know that she doesn't deserve to be treated this way." For a moment, it seemed like James might lunge at him. His hands curled into fists, and his jaw clenched tightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she braced herself for what might come next. But then the bus driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hey, keep it down back there, or I'm calling the cops." James hesitated, his anger wavering as he glanced around and saw the other passengers watching him. With a muttered curse, he sank back into his seat, his face dark with fury. The man gave him one last hard look before returning to his own seat, his eyes lingering on Emily for a moment. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. The rest of the bus ride passed in tense silence. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When their stop finally came, she stood quickly, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. James stumbled after her, grumbling under his breath. As they stepped off the bus, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the man standing behind her, his expression softer now. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, glancing at her father, who was already walking ahead, oblivious to the exchange. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The man studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to press further. Finally, he nodded. "If you ever need help," he said, his voice low, "don't be afraid to ask." Emily didn't respond. She simply nodded again before turning to follow her father, the man's words echoing in her mind as she walked away. She didn't know his name, but something about him made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A stranger's concern. The apartment door slammed shut behind James, rattling the frame and sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She stood in the narrow hallway, her backpack hanging limply from one shoulder, and listened to her father mutter curses as he stumbled toward the living room. The smell of stale beer and sweat clung to the air like an unwelcome guest. "Useless therapists, useless doctors," James growled, tossing his jacket onto the worn couch. He dropped into his favorite chair, the springs creaking under his weight, and reached for the remote. "All they care about is draining me dry." Emily stayed silent, slipping off her shoes and carefully setting them against the wall. She knew better than to respond, especially when he was like this. Instead, she made her way to her room, shutting the door quietly behind her. Her room was small, barely large enough for the twin bed and desk crammed into it. The walls were bare except for a single poster of a nebula she'd found at a second-hand store. It was the only thing in the apartment that felt like hers. Emily dropped her backpack onto the floor and sat on the bed, letting out a long, shaky breath. The events on the bus replayed in her mind, each word and gesture etched into her memory. She thought about the man who had stood up for her, his calm voice cutting through her father's anger like a lifeline. For a brief moment, she had felt seen, protected. But then the bus ride had ended, and reality had come rushing back. She pulled out her notebook, flipping through pages of sketches and half-finished homework assignments until she found a blank sheet. Drawing always helped her focus, helped her escape. She picked up her pencil and began to sketch the man's face, trying to capture the strength and kindness she had seen in his eyes. She didn't know why she was doing it. Maybe it was her way of holding on to the brief moment of safety he had given her. Meanwhile, Andrew Hayes sat in his modest apartment, his mind still replaying the scene on the bus. He had intended to spend the evening preparing for a veteran support event at the community center, but he couldn't shake the image of Emily and her father. The fear in her eyes, the resignation in her posture. It was all too familiar. Andrew leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as memories from his own childhood surfaced. His father had been much like James, angry, bitter, and too often drunk. The bruises Andrew had hidden, the excuses he had made, the long nights spent protecting his younger sister, they all came rushing back. He had promised himself he would never turn a blind eye to someone in need, especially a child. But what could he do? He had no authority in Emily's life, and the brief interaction on the bus had likely made things worse for her. Still, the thought of doing nothing left a sour taste in his mouth. Andrew pulled out his laptop, opening a search engine. He typed in the name of the hospital printed on the side of Emily's backpack, hoping it would lead him to some clue about her or her father. It was a long shot, but he had to try. After sifting through the hospital's website, he found a page listing local therapy programs for children. One of the therapist's names caught his eye, Dr. Catherine Davis. "That's a start," he muttered, jotting down the name and phone number. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the ethics of what he was about to do. But the image of Emily's face pushed him forward. Picking up his phone, he dialed the number. "Good evening. This is Dr. Catherine Davis's office," a cheerful voice answered. "Hi, my name is Andrew Hayes," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I'm calling because I recently encountered one of your patients, Emily Larson, and I'm concerned about her well-being. I understand if you can't share details, but I thought you should know about a situation I witnessed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but I can't discuss any patient information without consent. If you believe Emily is in danger, I encourage you to contact Child Protective Services." Andrew sighed. "I understand. Thank you." As he hung up, frustration bubbled within him. He had expected that response, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the notepad in front of him. If official channels weren't an option, he would have to find another way. Back in her room, Emily put the finishing touches on her sketch. She stared at the drawing of the man from the bus, a small smile tugging at her lips. He had stood up for her when no one else had. And for that, she was grateful. But she knew better than to hope for more. People didn't stay. They didn't fight for her. Not really. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts, loud and slurred as it called her name. She tensed, her stomach twisting into knots. Setting the notebook aside, she stood and opened her door cautiously. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. James was standing in the kitchen, holding his empty beer bottle. "We're out," he said, shaking the bottle for emphasis. "Go to the store and get me another pack." Emily's heart sank. She hated these trips. The cashier always gave her that pitying look, the one that said they knew exactly who the beer was for, but wouldn't say anything. She opened her mouth to protest, but James's glare stopped her. "Don't make me repeat myself," he said, his tone dangerous. Without another word, Emily grabbed her jacket and the crumpled bill he held out to her. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her like a breath of fresh air. She glanced back at the apartment, the yellow light spilling from the windows, and felt a pang of longing for something better. The walk to the store was short, but every step felt heavy. Emily kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the few people she passed. When she reached the store, she headed straight for the refrigerated section, grabbing the cheapest six-pack she could find. At the counter, the cashier gave her the same pitying look as always. "Rough night?" he asked, scanning the beer. Emily shrugged. "Just a normal one." The walk back was even harder. The weight of the beer seemed to drag her down, each step reminding her of the life she was returning to. As she reached the apartment building, she noticed a figure standing near the entrance. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was the man from the bus. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and confusion. He turned, offering her a small apologetic smile. "Emily, I'm sorry to bother you. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened earlier. Are you okay?" Emily hesitated, clutching the bag of beer tightly. She wanted to tell him everything, to pour out all the pain and fear she had been carrying for so long. But she couldn't. She shook her head. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "You shouldn't be here." Andrew nodded, his expression somber. "I know. But if you ever need help, I want you to know you're not alone." Before Emily could respond, the door behind her opened, and James's voice boomed out. "What the hell is going on out here?" Emily turned, her heart racing, as she saw her father's dark silhouette in the doorway. She could feel the anger radiating off him, and she knew this wasn't going to end well. Andrew stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Emily and James. "Just making sure Emily got home safe," he said calmly. James's eyes narrowed as he sized Andrew up. "I don't need some stranger looking after my daughter," he spat. "Get lost." Andrew didn't move. "With all due respect, Mr. Larson, I think Emily deserves better than this." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men stared each other down. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her pulse thundering in her ears. She wanted to scream, to beg them both to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, James sneered, grabbing the bag from Emily's hands. "Stay out of our business," he said, retreating inside and slamming the door. Emily stood frozen, staring at the closed door, her chest tight with unspoken words. Andrew hesitated, his expression pained. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I'll go. But if you ever need me—" "I'll be fine," Emily interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned and disappeared into the building, leaving Andrew standing alone in the night, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't just walk away. A plan in motion. Andrew stood outside the apartment building for a long moment, staring at the door that had slammed shut behind Emily. The chill of the night settled over him, but he barely noticed. His thoughts churned, weighed down by the helplessness that had taken root in his chest. Every instinct told him to walk away. He had no right to intervene further, and Emily herself had asked him to stay out of it. But that wasn't who he was. He couldn't ignore what he'd seen and heard. He couldn't shake the image of Emily clutching that bag of beer, her shoulders hunched under the weight of fear and responsibility that no 14-year-old should bear. He had seen too many kids like her, kids trapped in situations they couldn't escape, too afraid or too resigned to ask for help. "Not this time," Andrew muttered under his breath. He turned and walked briskly to his car, his mind already racing with ideas. He had connections, people who worked with child advocacy groups, social workers, and law enforcement. While he didn't want to involve the authorities prematurely, he knew he needed more information to make a difference. Emily needed someone in her corner, and Andrew was determined to be that person, whether she realized it or not. As he drove, Andrew pulled out his phone and called a close friend, Sarah Mitchell, a social worker he'd met during a veterans outreach program. Sarah was tough, resourceful, and had a reputation for going above and beyond for her cases. "Andrew." Sarah's voice was groggy, and he glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. "Hey, Sarah, I'm sorry to call so late," he said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I need your help." "Must be serious if you're calling me at this hour," Sarah replied, her tone shifting to one of concern. "What's going on?" Andrew quickly recounted the events of the day, sparing no detail. By the time he finished, Sarah was silent for a moment. "This girl, Emily," Sarah said finally. "It sounds like she's in a dangerous situation, but without her cooperation, it's tricky. Children often protect their abusive parents out of fear or misguided loyalty. Does she have any other family?" "I don't know," Andrew admitted. "Her father mentioned her mother, but it sounded like she's not in the picture. I need to find out more about their history, about her father's background." "Can you help me?" Sarah sighed. "I can pull some strings, see if there are any reports filed on him or anything in the system. But Andrew, if you suspect she's in immediate danger, You need to call CPS or the police." "I will," Andrew promised. "But I want to do this right. If I go in guns blazing, it might push her away, or worse, escalate the situation." "Fair enough," Sarah said. "I'll see what I can dig up. But Andrew, be careful. People like this father of hers, they can get unpredictable when cornered." "Thanks, Sarah," Andrew said. "I owe you one." "You owe me more than one," she replied, her tone lightening slightly. "I'll call you as soon as I have anything." Meanwhile, inside the apartment, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, watching her father gulp down another beer. The television blared in the background, but James wasn't paying attention. His focus was on the bottle in his hand, his movements sluggish and unsteady. Emily wished she could disappear. Her fingers itched to pick up her sketchbook again, to lose herself in lines and shapes. But she knew better than to leave the table without permission. She traced a small scratch on the wooden surface, trying to keep her breathing steady. "You've been acting strange," James said suddenly, his voice slurred but sharp enough to cut through the haze. "Talking to that guy outside. What was that about?" Emily's stomach dropped. She shook her head quickly. "Nothing, Dad. He was just checking if I was okay." "Like hell it was nothing," James snapped, slamming the bottle down on the table. "You've been sneaking around, haven't you? Telling people our business." "No," Emily protested, her voice rising in panic. "I didn't say anything, I swear." James leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "You think I don't know what's going on? You're just like your mother, always looking for someone else to solve your problems. Well, newsflash, kid, no one's coming to save you." The words hit her like a slap, and Emily felt tears sting her eyes. She bit her lip hard, refusing to cry in front of him. Crying only made things worse. James waved his hand dismissively and leaned back in his chair. "Just stay out of trouble, Emily. We don't need anyone poking their noses where they don't belong." Emily nodded silently, her chest aching with a mixture of anger and helplessness. She wanted to scream, to tell him how wrong he was, but she knew it would only fuel his rage. Andrew parked his car near the apartment complex, deciding he wasn't ready to go home yet. He sat there for a moment, staring at the building and wondering if Emily was okay. The thought of her inside, enduring more of her father's drunken tirades, filled him with frustration. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information on James Larson. It didn't take long to find a few threads: a minor arrest for public intoxication, a foreclosure on a house 3 years ago, and a short obituary for a woman named Marie Larson, Emily's mother. Andrew clicked on the obituary, his heart sinking as he read. Marie had died in a car accident when Emily was just 10 years old. James was listed as her surviving spouse, with no mention of other family members. Andrew leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Emily had been through so much already, and it was clear her father's downward spiral had only made things worse. A knock on his car window startled him. He turned to see Sarah standing outside, holding a folder. Andrew rolled down the window, surprised to see her in person. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said, handing him the folder. "I thought I'd bring this to you instead of waiting until morning." Andrew opened the folder and scanned the contents. Sarah had managed to pull records on James, including reports of domestic disturbances that had been called in by neighbors. None of the reports had resulted in charges, but they painted a clear picture of a man struggling with alcohol and anger issues. "This is a start," Andrew said, his jaw tightening. "Thanks, Sarah." "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "What's your next move?" Andrew hesitated, staring at the apartment building. "I'm not sure, but I can't just leave her in there." Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "Just be careful, Andrew. You can't save everyone." Andrew nodded, but as Sarah walked away, he couldn't help but think, "I'm not leaving this one behind." He closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and stepped out of the car. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do next, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Emily deserved better, and he was going to make sure she got it, even if it meant taking risks he wasn't sure he could afford. The strength to speak. The morning light crept through the thin curtains in Emily's room, casting pale rays across the cluttered floor. She sat cross-legged on her bed, sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her pencil moved swiftly, almost automatically, as she tried to escape into the lines and shapes she created. Her latest drawing was a scene from memory. The man from the bus standing tall and calm, his figure a protective barrier between her and her father. She stared at the unfinished sketch, her mind replaying the previous night's events. Her father's slurred accusations, the weight of his anger, it all swirled in her head like a storm. But amid the chaos, one thought stood out. Why had Mr. Hayes come back? A sharp knock at her door broke her concentration. Emily, her father's gruff voice called, tinged with irritation. Get out here. Now. Emily's stomach tightened. She set her sketchbook aside and opened the door to find James standing there, holding an envelope. His face was pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he held it out to her. What's this? She asked cautiously. You tell me. James snapped, shoving the envelope into her hands. Found it stuffed in the mailbox this morning. Emily unfolded the paper inside, her eyes scanning the typed words. It was a letter, brief but direct. Emily, if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who cares, please don't hesitate to reach out. Andrew Hayes. Phone number. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and dread washing over her. She glanced up at her father, who was glaring at her, his expression dark and accusatory. Who's Andrew Hayes? He demanded. He's. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. He's just someone from the bus. He was just being nice. James's lips curled into a sneer. Being nice. Don't play dumb with me. You've been running your mouth, haven't you? Telling strangers our business. No. Emily protested, her voice rising in panic. I didn't tell him anything, I swear. James crumpled the letter in his fist, his face reddening. You're lying. You think I don't know what's going on. You're trying to make me look like the bad guy. Emily stepped back, her hands shaking. Dad, please. Before James could say more, a sharp knock at the front door startled them both. James turned, muttering under his breath as he stomped toward the door. Emily stayed frozen in place, her heart pounding. When James opened the door, Andrew Hayes stood on the other side. You again, James growled, his grip tightening on the doorframe. What the hell do you want? Andrew didn't flinch. His calm demeanor was unshaken, but his voice carried an edge of firmness. Good morning, Mr. Larson. I was hoping to speak with Emily. She doesn't need to talk to you, James snapped. We don't need your charity or your meddling. Andrew's eyes flicked past James, meeting Emily's for a brief moment. He saw the fear in her eyes, the tension in her posture, and it strengthened his resolve. I understand you're upset, Andrew said evenly, but this isn't about charity. It's about making sure Emily knows she has someone to turn to if she ever needs help. She doesn't need help, James shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. We're fine. You're the one causing problems, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Emily's breath hitched as she watched the exchange. She wanted to speak up, to tell Andrew she appreciated his concern, but the weight of her father's anger kept her silent. Fine, Andrew said finally, taking a step back. But if Emily ever decides she does need someone, she knows where to find me. He reached into his pocket and handed James a second copy of the letter. James snatched it from his hand, crumpling it immediately. Get lost, James growled, slamming the door. The loud bang echoed through the apartment. James turned to Emily, his face twisted with rage. You think this is a game? He snarled. You think you can go crying to strangers and make me out to be the villain? Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't. Shut up, James roared, raising his hand. Before he could strike, the door burst open again. Andrew stood in the doorway, his expression dark and determined. Behind him were two uniformed police officers. "Mr. Larson," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "we need to speak with you." James froze, his arms still raised. His face went pale as he registered the seriousness of the situation. "What is this?" he stammered. "You can't just barge in here. We have reason to believe your daughter may be in danger." The officer interrupted, his tone firm. "We need to ensure her safety." Emily's knees nearly gave out as the tension in the room shifted. The officers moved toward her father, their presence commanding and unyielding. James spluttered, trying to argue, but the officers were already leading him toward the door. "I didn't do anything," James shouted as they escorted him out. "This is all a misunderstanding." Andrew stepped inside, his expression softening as he approached Emily. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "I think so," she whispered. The second officer stayed behind, kneeling down to Emily's eye level. "Emily, we're here to help," she said softly. "Can you tell us if your father has hurt you?" Emily hesitated, glancing toward the door where James had disappeared. Her mind swirled with fear and uncertainty, but then she looked at Andrew. His steady gaze, filled with patience and understanding, gave her the strength she needed. He gets angry," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Sometimes he yells a lot. And sometimes he hits me." The officer nodded, her expression calm but empathetic. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You're very brave, Emily. We're going to make sure you're safe." As the officer stood and began making arrangements, Andrew stayed by Emily's side. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Andrew smiled gently. "Because I've been where you are," he said. "And I know what it feels like to think no one's on your side. But you're not alone, Emily. Not anymore." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, like a seedling breaking through the cracks of a barren field, but it was there. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. Someone cared enough to stand up for her, and that made all the difference. The fragile thread of hope. The sirens had faded into the distance, and for a moment, all that remained was the eerie stillness of the apartment. Emily sat on the couch, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the empty doorway where her father had just been led away by the officers. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air, a mixture of relief and fear settling in her chest. She could still feel the sting of her father's words, his accusatory tone, the unspoken threat in his eyes as the officers had restrained him. He hadn't really looked at her. He hadn't seen her. Not like this. Not for who she was, not for all the progress she had made, not for the child she longed to be seen as. To him, she had always been an inconvenience, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong in his life. But today, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had been noticed. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't invisible. The officer who had spoken with her earlier, Officer Jenkins, returned to the apartment. She was tall, with a no-nonsense demeanor, but her eyes softened when she saw Emily sitting there, her head bowed in quiet contemplation. "Emily," she said gently, sitting down next to her, "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that we're going to make sure you're safe." Emily nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She had spent so long hiding her pain, locking it away, that even now, with the officers here, she didn't know how to let it out, how to tell them what she had lived through. "I didn't want this to happen," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced up at Officer Jenkins, her eyes welling with unused tears. "I didn't want to get him in trouble." Officer Jenkins looked at her, her expression softening further. "You're not the one who caused this, Emily. Your father's actions are his responsibility. You've done nothing wrong." Emily shook her head, her mind racing with guilt. "But I'm the reason he's like this. If I was different, maybe he wouldn't be so angry all the time. Maybe he'd—" "Emily, Officer Jenkins interrupted, her voice firm but kind. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? Your father's actions are on him. You've done your best to survive, and that's all anyone can ask of you. A sob escaped Emily's throat, the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear those words until now. She had spent so long internalizing her father's anger, convincing herself that everything wrong in their lives was because of her, that hearing someone else validate her pain felt like a weight being lifted. I'm sorry, Emily whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just wanted him to love me again. Officer Jenkins placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You deserve love, Emily. You deserve to be safe, to be happy. And you'll get there. We'll help you. As the police continued to process the scene, Emily was quietly escorted to a nearby child welfare center where a team of specialists would evaluate her situation further. Andrew Hayes, still in the background, had stayed close, watching over her from a distance, giving her the space she needed. He knew this part of the process would be difficult, but he also knew it was necessary. Emily was strong, but she couldn't carry this burden on her own any longer. He waited outside the building, pacing in small, tight circles. He wanted to be there for her, but he also understood that she needed professionals now. She needed people who could guide her through the maze of emotions, who could give her the support and resources to rebuild her life. And he could only offer his presence, his patience, his unwavering commitment that he would be there if she needed him. Andrew had always prided himself on his ability to stay detached, to compartmentalize his feelings. But this situation had cracked him open in ways he hadn't anticipated. The thought of Emily, alone and vulnerable, forced him to confront a part of himself that he had long buried. He knew too well what it was like to grow up in a toxic environment, to be caught in the web of anger and neglect. But for Emily, he could do something. He had to do something. As he stood by the entrance, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing Sarah's name on the screen. He answered quickly, his voice low. Hey, Sarah, what do you have for me? I got some updates, Sarah said. I managed to get in touch with a few people from the local shelters and foster care systems. There's an opening for Emily in a short-term housing program, and we can begin the process of getting her into a more stable environment soon. Andrew felt a surge of relief, but also an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. That's great news. What about her father? There's a history of domestic disturbance calls, Sarah replied, her tone serious. Nothing that led to formal charges, but it's clear he's been a constant issue. We've got some paperwork in motion, but for now, the priority is getting Emily into a safe space. Got it. Thanks, Sarah. I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Andrew, she replied. Just do me a favor. Keep checking on her, okay? She's going to need a support system, and you're the one person she trusts right now. Andrew nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see him. I will. I'm not going anywhere. Inside the welfare center, Emily sat quietly in a small, sterile room. The walls were painted a dull white, and there was a worn-out rug in the center of the floor. She hated how empty it felt, how alone she felt. But as she stared at the door, waiting for someone to come in, she reminded herself that this was a new beginning. This was the first step towards something different. The door opened, and a woman in her mid-30s entered the room. She was tall and calm, her features gentle but purposeful. She smiled at Emily as she sat down across from her, folding her hands on the table. Hi, Emily, the woman said softly. I'm Dr. Laura McKinley. I'm here to help you, okay? Emily nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure what to expect, but something in Dr. McKinley's presence calmed her. The woman's demeanor was non-threatening, her eyes warm with understanding. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, Dr. McKinley said. You're not alone anymore. Emily looked up, her voice barely a whisper. What's going to happen now? Dr. McKinley leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but not without kindness. "First, we'll make sure you're safe. Then we'll talk about what comes next. You'll have options, and we'll take it one step at a time. I'll be with you through every part of it." Emily swallowed, her chest tightening once more. She wanted to believe that things could be different, but the weight of the past was hard to shake. For so long, she had been stuck in a cycle of fear and confusion, unsure of where to turn. But now, with someone finally standing by her, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. And for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to believe that this might not be the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, just maybe, she could heal. A new dawn. The morning sunlight poured through the window, casting a soft, golden glow on the walls of the small room Emily had been staying in for the past few days. It was nothing like the cold, sterile walls of the hospital or the grim apartment she had left behind, but it felt different. The air here was lighter, calmer. She still wasn't used to it, but every day she spent away from her father felt like a small victory. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the edge of a notebook she had found on the table beside her. It was a new one, a fresh start, a gift from Dr. McKinley, who had spent hours talking to her over the last few days. The woman had patiently walked her through everything, explaining the process, offering her space to process her emotions at her own pace. Emily hadn't known it was possible to feel this safe. It felt strange, sitting still without the constant, oppressive weight of her father's anger looming over her. The silence here was different too, peaceful, almost. She could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant chatter of other kids in the common area outside, but it was all faint and easy to ignore. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like every noise was a potential threat. Emily turned the notebook in her hands, staring at the blank pages. She had been keeping her thoughts locked inside for so long, but now she wasn't sure what to write. Part of her felt like she didn't even know who she was anymore. How do you put into words the weight of years of emotional scars? How do you explain the years of watching someone you loved crumble into something unrecognizable? How do you make sense of the confusion, the fear, the guilt? She swallowed hard, trying to push the knot of anxiety back down. The door to her room creaked open, and she looked up to find Dr. McKinley standing there, her smile warm as always. "Morning, Emily," Dr. McKinley said, her tone light. "How are you feeling today?" Emily gave her a small, tentative smile, but her mind was still tangled up. "I don't know. It's still weird here. Quiet." "That's okay," Dr. McKinley replied, sitting down across from her. "It's normal to feel that way. Change is hard, especially after everything you've been through. But you're safe now, and that's what matters." The words felt true, but Emily couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was getting used to it. The silence, the safety, the feeling of not constantly having to wash her back. She didn't know how long she would stay in the temporary shelter, but in this moment, the idea of staying here forever didn't seem so impossible. "Do you want to talk about anything?" Dr. McKinley asked gently. "Anything on your mind?" Emily hesitated. Her eyes flicked back down to the notebook in her lap, the blank pages staring back at her. She wanted to tell Dr. McKinley everything. The hurt, the anger, the resentment. But she didn't know where to begin. She didn't know what was safe to say, what she was allowed to feel without feeling like she was burdening someone else. Instead, she shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know what happens next." Dr. McKinley's smile softened, and she nodded in understanding. "That's completely okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. The important thing is that you've taken the first step toward healing. And that's huge, Emily. Not everyone has the strength to do that." Emily bit her lip, her fingers still nervously twisting the notebook's cover. She wanted to believe what Dr. McKinley was saying, but part of her couldn't help but feel like there was something more, something she was missing. What if I'm just making it all up? She blurted out. What if this is just my fault? What if he's right, and I'm just causing all of this? Dr. McKinley's expression turned serious. Emily, listen to me. You are not to blame for any of this. No one deserves to be treated the way you've been treated, especially not by someone who is supposed to love them. Your father's actions are his, and his alone. His anger, his behavior, they have nothing to do with you. But I've been trying to fix it, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I've tried so hard. I've tried everything to make him happy, to make him love me again. But nothing works. It never works. Dr. McKinley's eyes softened, and she leaned in slightly. You can't fix other people's problems, especially when those problems have nothing to do with you. You are allowed to be yourself, Emily, and you are worthy of love and respect just as you are. Your father's choices are his responsibility, not yours. Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She hadn't cried in so long, and now that the dam had broken, it felt like everything was rushing out at once. The pain, the frustration, the years of feeling like she wasn't good enough, it was all there, flooding her chest. Dr. McKinley reached over and gently took Emily's hand in hers. It's okay to feel all of this. You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore. Emily sniffled, her throat tight. She nodded, though she still felt so much uncertainty swirling inside her. What happens next? She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do I have to go back to him? The question hung in the air, thick with fear. Emily couldn't imagine going back to the place she had just left. The place where every day had felt like a battle. It was where her father's rage had ruled their lives, where she had learned to shrink into herself just to avoid the storm. Dr. McKinley's expression softened, her voice steady. No, Emily. You don't have to go back. Right now, you are in a safe place, and you have options. We'll help you explore them. You won't have to face this alone anymore. The words felt like a lifeline. Emily didn't know what those options were, but the mere fact that she had choices, that there was a possibility for something different, was enough to stir something deep inside her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. Maybe she could build a new life for herself, away from the anger and fear that had always defined her existence. Her hand tightened around the notebook, her fingers curling into the cover. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to feel something she hadn't let herself feel before. Hope. Dr. McKinley smiled at her, her voice gentle. You're doing great, Emily. We're here for you, every step of the way. As the hours passed, Emily felt the weight on her shoulders slowly begin to lift. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where the road ahead would take her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer defined by the anger and bitterness of her father. And for the first time in her life, Emily allowed herself to believe that she had the power to create a future for herself, a future filled with the hope she had never dared to dream about before. It was just the beginning. But it was a beginning, and that was enough.